Aujourd'hui, je vois des
Today,
élus venant
I see representatives from every part of Canada.
It happened minutes ago, not in front of cameras, not beneath chandeliers, but in the quiet space where the Crown makes its most unforgiving demands. A decision was finalized that could not be delayed another day, a choice shaped by fear, duty, and the slow closing of time. What King Charles III agreed to in silence will protect the monarchy and leave a wound inside the family that may never fully heal. This was not a political calculation. It was a heartbreaking surrender to the crown itself. The choice made. The decision was finalized minutes ago, but its roots stretched back years. It came together in the early winter hours, when the palace was stripped of ceremony and reduced to its most essential truth: power exercised in silence. No press team waited, no statement was drafted. No one outside a narrow inner circle understood that a line, one that had been debated, avoided, and quietly feared, was about to be crossed. King Charles III had been awake long before the briefing began. Sleep had become fractured in recent months, not because of indecision, but because of accumulation. Every unresolved issue had begun pressing at once, stacking itself into a single, unavoidable reckoning. This decision was not sudden. It was delayed, deferred, reframed repeatedly in the hope that time might soften its edges. Time had done the opposite. The final briefing was short, painfully so. No one in the room attempted persuasion anymore. That phase had passed weeks earlier, when alternatives were still being entertained. What remained now was confirmation, a procedural closing of doors that had been left ajar too long. The language used was restrained, almost antiseptic. Access would be withdrawn, channels would be closed, residual privileges would be terminated without ceremony or transition, not suspended, not reviewed, terminated. Charles listened without interruption. Those who know him best recognize the signs of emotional strain not in agitation but in stillness. His hands rested flat on the table. His gaze did not wander. He did not ask clarifying questions because he already understood the implications better than anyone else in the room. This was not about governance. It was about loss. For decades, Charles had lived with the belief, sometimes naive, sometimes stubborn, that relationships could be managed alongside duty. That compassion and continuity did not have to be enemies, that the crown, while demanding, could still accommodate history. That belief had eroded slowly, then suddenly. In recent months, the situation confronting him had crossed a threshold from uncomfortable to dangerous. What had once been manageable background noise had begun to intrude into strategic planning. Advisors stopped speaking hypothetically. Their tone shifted from suggestion to warning. The monarchy, they said, could no longer carry unresolved emotional weight at its center. Charles did not argue. He had seen this pattern before. He had lived through it as a son, watching his mother make choices that appeared cold from the outside but proved essential in hindsight. He had promised himself, often, that he would do things differently when his time came, but the crown does not honor promises made in youth. It tests them. The briefing ended without flourish. No one congratulated him. No one expressed relief. This was not a victory. It was a surrender to necessity. Charles nodded once. That single gesture authorized everything. The aides gathered their papers and left the room, careful not to look back. Protocol dictates efficiency in moments like this, not because emotion is forbidden, but because acknowledging it complicates execution. Charles remained seated long after the door closed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with memory, with faces and voices from earlier chapters of his life, when loyalty had not yet been weaponized and affection had not yet been measured for risk. This was the moment the crown demanded something irrevocable. What made it heartbreaking was not uncertainty. Charles was certain. He knew this was the correct decision for the institution. That clarity, however, offered no comfort. Because certainty does not erase grief. He understood precisely what he had chosen. Not just stability, but solitude. Not just order, but distance. The crown, once again, had asserted its oldest rule. It will survive, even if it must hollow out the person wearing it. When Charles finally stood, his movement was slow, deliberate. There was no collapse, no visible crack. Kings are trained not to fracture. They are trained to absorb. Outside the room, the palace continued as though nothing had happened. Courtiers passed in corridors unaware that a personal era had ended. Schedules moved forward. The machinery of monarchy never pauses for feeling. But something fundamental had shifted. This decision was not dramatic enough to leak immediately. There would be no breaking headlines, no urgent alerts. Its effects would emerge gradually in absences, in silences, in the quiet disappearance of names from conversations where they once lingered. That was intentional. The most effective royal decisions rarely announce themselves. They reveal themselves over time. Charles knew this too. He had lived long enough inside the system to understand how history would eventually describe this moment, not as heartbreak, but as stewardship, not as a loss, but as leadership. Yet history would not sit with him tonight. History would not absorb the ache that settled in his chest as he walked away from the room where the decision had been made. History would not feel the narrowing of his emotional world, the quiet realization that another piece of his private self had been surrendered to something larger and colder. The unexplainable demands. The Crown did not ask for this decision lightly. It pressed for it slowly, methodically, the way institutions do when they are running out of patience but not yet out of options. For months, the issue had lived in the margins of briefings, surfacing at the end of agendas, framed as something that could be revisited later. Later arrived faster than anyone expected. Inside the palace, a subtle shift had been taking place. The language of discussion hardened. What had once been described as sensitive began to be called unstable. What had been manageable became exposed. These were not emotional judgments, they were institutional diagnoses. At the center of it all sat King Charles III, listening as advisors walked him through scenarios they no longer enjoyed presenting. The monarchy, they explained, was entering a compression phase. Time, once expansive, was now constricted. The king's health, carefully managed and publicly framed with reassurance, had nonetheless altered internal planning, not in panic, but in priority. There would be no indulgence for unresolved complications. Every loose end carried weight. Every unresolved relationship, every lingering ambiguity of access or loyalty became a variable in succession modeling. And succession modeling does not tolerate sentiment. The Crown requires predictability. Not warmth, not forgiveness, predictability. What worried advisors most was not what had happened in the past, but what could still be implied in the present. The monarchy no longer had the luxury of allowing proximity to be misread as endorsement. Silence could be reframed as hesitation. Restraint could be weaponized as weakness. Even inaction had become an action. Charles had seen this dynamic before. He remembered moments during his mother's reign when doing nothing proved more destabilizing than doing something unpopular. Ambiguity breeds interpretation, and interpretation, left unchecked, becomes narrative. Narrative is power, and power, when uncontrolled, becomes a threat. The situation confronting the Crown carried all the markers of escalation. External observers were circling familiar themes. Internal reports flagged growing risk of reputational drag. Advisors warned that future transitions would be burdened by unresolved emotional entanglements if nothing changed. The monarchy had reached the point where management was no longer sufficient. Containment had failed. This realization did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like a pressure that never quite releases. Charles felt it most acutely in the tone of the briefings. Gone were the careful hypotheticals. In their place were timelines, probabilities, and consequences. He asked pointed questions. How long could the situation remain contained? What would escalation look like if it occurred during a transition? Could the heir inherit this unresolved complexity without damage? The answers were measured and bleak. Containment could not be guaranteed. Escalation would be unpredictable. And the inheritance of this unresolved issue would place an unfair burden on the future king. That last point mattered deeply to Charles. He has lived his life in the shadow of a crown he did not inherit easily. He understands the cost of carrying unresolved history forward. He understands how past compromises become future constraints. He would not do that to his son. In private, he began reframing the decision not as an act of removal, but as an act of protection. Protection of the institution, protection of the succession, protection of the future from the mistakes of the past. That reframing helped him function, but it did not make the choice easier. Advisors emphasized another uncomfortable truth. Half measures were no longer viable. Any attempt to soften the outcome would be interpreted externally as weakness and internally as indecision. The monarchy had already suffered reputational damage from prolonged ambiguity. This time, clarity had to be absolute. No transition period, no symbolic gestures, no residual access. The crown could not afford reinterpretation. Charles recognized recognized the severity of what was being asked. He also recognized its necessity. This was not about punishment or blame, it was about closing a chapter that refused to end on its own. The most painful realization came last. If the decision were delayed further, it would eventually be forced, but under worse conditions, under greater scrutiny, under less control, under circumstances where emotion, not strategy, would dictate timing. Charles has always feared reactive leadership more than unpopular leadership. Reactive leadership fractures institutions, so he chose to act while he still could. In doing so, he accepted that history would judge the outcome, not the intention. That compassion unexpressed would not count for much in institutional memory. That restraint would be invisible, while the consequence would be permanent. The Crown demanded closure because closure is the only state in which planning can resume without fear. It demanded sacrifice because survival often does. By the time the final recommendation reached his desk, the decision had already taken shape in Charles's mind, not as a question of whether, but of when. And when finally arrived, it came with a terrible clarity. The Crown did not want another discussion. It wanted an ending. Charles gave it one. The private cost. What the Crown required, King Charles III carried alone. That solitude was not ceremonial. It was real, unshared, and deliberately protected from view. Kings are allowed advisors, not witnesses. When decisions reach this level of personal consequence, they are absorbed inward, where they cannot destabilize the machinery that depends on the appearance of certainty. In the days leading up to the final authorization, Charles's behavior shifted in ways subtle enough to escape public notice, but unmistakable to those who know him best. He grew quieter, not withdrawn but contained. Conversations that once wandered into memory or philosophy now ended cleanly, as though he were rationing emotional energy. This was not avoidance, it was preparation. Charles has always been a man who feels deeply, even when protocol requires restraint. Long before the crown settled on his head, he carried relationships as living things, fragile, enduring, and meaningful beyond their utility. He believed, perhaps longer than he should have, that loyalty could coexist with institutional responsibility. That belief had survived scandals, transitions, and decades of waiting. This decision shattered it. At night, when the palace quieted and duty loosened its grip, Charles found himself revisiting moments that now felt dangerously tender. Not dramatic scenes, not conflicts, but ordinary memories, shared laughter, mutual understanding, periods when affection existed without consequence. Those memories were not indulgences. They were acknowledgments, because Charles understood that once this line was crossed, there would be no safe space for nostalgia. Memory itself would become a liability, capable of reopening doors the crown had ordered sealed. He did not speak of this to anyone. Not to advisors, who would see it as a weakness, not to family, who would feel its weight too heavily. He absorbed it in silence, the way monarchs are taught to do. The private cost of the decision was not regret. Charles did not doubt the necessity of what he was doing. Instead, the cost lay in recognition of the realization that certain versions of himself no longer fit inside the role he occupied. There was a man who believed in reconciliation through patience. There was a man who believed love could be managed rather than severed. That man had no place here anymore. The crown does not accommodate emotional complexity when clarity is required. It does not negotiate with history. It demands finality, and it demands it from the person least able to escape the consequences. Charles felt this acutely. He read the authorization documents slowly, even though he already knew their content. The language was cold, efficient, stripped of anything that might invite interpretation. No acknowledgments of shared past. No allowances for future reconsideration. This was intentional. The crown speaks in absolutes when it wants to ensure there is no return path. Signing his name felt less like an action and more like a closure, not of policy, but of possibility. Charles understood that whatever remained unsaid after this moment would remain unsaid forever. After the documents were signed and the aides dismissed, Charles stayed in the room far longer than protocol required. There was no one to perform for, no role to maintain, just a man sitting with the understanding that he had chosen the institution over intimacy in its most literal form. He thought briefly of his mother, not sentimentally, but practically, of the countless times she must have faced similar moments without the luxury of explanation or comfort, of how often she chose silence not because she felt nothing, but because feeling could not be allowed to interfere. Only now did Charles fully understand how isolating that discipline must have been. When he finally rose, the weight did not lift. it settled. From that moment forward, Charles moved with a different internal calibration, not colder, but narrower, more careful about what he allowed himself to feel and when. The crown had taken something essential, and he instinctively began guarding what remained. Those closest to him sensed the shift almost immediately, not in his speech or demeanor, but in absence. Fewer reflective asides, less visible nostalgia, a quiet retreat from emotional openness that had once defined him. This was not a breakdown, it was an adaptation. The crown demands adaptation above all else. Charles emerged into the next day composed, disciplined, and fully functional. Meetings resumed. State matters continued. No one outside the inner circle suspected the magnitude of what had been surrendered. That is the paradox of monarchy. Its most painful choices rarely look painful at all, but inside the king, the cost had already been paid. Not in spectacle, not in tears, but in the quiet recalibration of a heart that had learned once again that survival comes at the price of narrowing one's inner world. And Charles, alone, had absorbed its consequence. Unbelievable reaction. The decision did not echo through the family with noise. It moved the way cold moves slowly, silently, and with a certainty that cannot be reversed once felt. Inside royal families, seismic shifts are rarely announced. They are sensed. A call not returned, a meeting removed from a diary, a familiar name absent from a briefing where it once appeared without question. By the time confirmation arrives, the emotional ground has already changed. That was how the family learned what King Charles III had done. The first to fully grasp the permanence of the choice was Prince William. William had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized. In private discussions over the past year, he had spoken with increasing clarity about the danger of unresolved personal entanglements near the crown. His tone was never emotional. It was structural. He framed everything in terms of risk, precedent, and long-term survivability. Where others still hoped time might soften outcomes, William believed delay only magnified damage. When confirmation reached him, there was no visible reaction, no relief, no triumph, no satisfaction. Instead, there was a brief stillness, the kind that comes when expectation meets reality. William understood why his father had acted. More than that, he understood why the decision had been delayed as long as it had. Charles's emotional instincts were well known within the family. His desire to preserve connection, even at cost, had shaped many earlier choices. This time, however, duty had overridden instinct. That mattered. For William, the decision represented more than closure. It was a signal that the monarchy was finally aligning with the principles he believed were necessary for its future. Clear boundaries, enforced consequences, no emotional exemptions. Yet even he could not ignore the personal toll. William has always been more guarded than his father, less inclined to linger in memory or sentiment, but he is not indifferent. He watched closely for signs of strain in Charles, not out of concern for optics, but out of familial recognition. He saw them. The slight withdrawal, the tightening of focus, the absence of casual warmth that once surfaced in private moments. William understood that the crown had not just taken something from the institution, it had taken something from his father. That understanding did not weaken his resolve, it hardened it. If this was the price of survival, then survival would demand discipline from everyone. Others within the family responded differently. For some, the decision felt abrupt, even if its logic was clear. Royal families are accustomed to slow fades, not definitive endings. Relationships erode gradually. Access narrows quietly. Finality is rare. This was final. There were moments of disbelief not expressed openly, but shared in glances and cautious conversations behind closed doors. Questions surfaced without expectation of answers. Could it really be permanent? Would there be reconsideration? There would not. That truth settled heavily. Queen Camilla absorbed the decision with outward composure, but inward conflict. Camilla has always believed in management rather than severance. Her instincts lean toward containment, toward keeping doors slightly open so pressure can escape rather than build. She understands survival not as rigidity, but as adaptation. This decision ran counter to those instincts. She did not challenge the king, not publicly, not privately in any way that mattered. She understood the reasoning. She recognized the institutional necessity, but she also understood the emotional violence of absolute closure. More than anyone else, She worried about it. Charles, not about his authority, not about perception, about isolation. She had lived alongside him long enough to know how deeply he feels loss, even when he does not show it. She had seen what prolonged emotional constraint does to him, how it narrows his inner life, how it hardens reflection into silence. This decision threatened to accelerate that process. Within the family, the shift altered dynamics almost immediately. Conversations became more deliberate. Emotional territory was approached cautiously, if at all. Everyone sensed that the monarchy had crossed into a new phase, one less tolerant of ambiguity, less forgiving of unresolved history. That realization changed behavior. Those who once believed time would soften consequences reconsidered. Those who assumed loyalty would always protect proximity began recalibrating expectations. The crown had drawn a line that could not be ignored. It was not cruelty, it was clear. And clarity, in families built around power, reshapes relationships faster than conflict ever could. No one openly criticized the decision. That would have been pointless and dangerous. But internally, each member of the family adjusted their understanding of what the crown would now tolerate. The era of negotiated emotional space was ending. What replaced it was colder but more predictable. For William, this marked a quiet transfer of moral authority. Not officially, not ceremonially, but structurally. The institution was moving closer to the future he envisioned, and further from the compromises that had defined its recent past. For Charles, the family's reaction reinforced the loneliness of the choice. He saw the recalibration happening around him. He understood that trust, once tested by such a decision, does not rebound easily. But he did not retreat. He had crossed the line the crown demanded, and the family, whether in agreement or grief, now had to live with it. The sacrifice. The sacrifice demanded by the crown was not symbolic, and it was not abstract. It had shape, it had memory, and it carried a cost that would not fade simply because the institution stabilized. What King Charles III surrendered at this moment was not merely access or protocol. It was the last remaining belief that certain bonds could exist safely outside the logic of monarchy, that history once formed could be preserved without consequence. For years, the crown had tolerated ambiguity because ambiguity felt humane. It allowed space for gradual adjustment, for quiet accommodation, for the illusion that no one had been truly lost. But illusion, once relied upon too heavily, becomes dangerous. The decision eliminated that illusion entirely. The measures were comprehensive, not punitive, but absolute. Channels once kept open for courtesy were closed without ceremony. Informal allowances that had survived through inertia were withdrawn in a single sweep. What remained after that moment was not hostility, but absence. Absence is more effective. The internal language was deliberately stark, not because the crown wished to be cruel, but because cruelty can be debated, while clarity cannot. Each line was crafted to remove interpretation, to leave no space where hope could be quietly nursed and later weaponized. This was not exile performed for spectacle. It was erased and executed for survival. Charles understood precisely what this meant. He had lived long enough inside the institution to know that once someone is removed thoroughly, there is no organic path back. Even if contact were to resume someday in some diminished form, the emotional symmetry would be gone. Trust would never return to its original shape. What followed surprised even those who had advocated for the decision. The institution stabilized almost immediately. Internal assessments shifted tone. Meetings that had once been dominated by contingency planning now moved forward with confidence. The constant hum of unresolved risk present for years fell quiet. From a purely strategic standpoint, the sacrifice worked. That truth did not comfort Charles. Because effectiveness does not soften loss, it confirms it. In the days after the decision, he noticed how quickly the machinery adjusted, how easily the crown absorbed what had once seemed emotionally impossible. Schedules recalibrated, protocol adapted. The monarchy, as it always does, proved it could function without regard for personal cost. That realization carried its own sting. The sacrifice also sent a message, and everyone inside the royal orbit understood it. No one was indispensable, no history was sacred, no bond survived if it threatened institutional coherence. This message landed heavily with Prince William. William had long believed that the monarchy's greatest weakness was its reluctance to close doors completely. Partial measures created ongoing vulnerability. Compassion, when extended indefinitely, blurred lines that should remain sharp. This decision confirmed his analysis, but it also revealed something else, something William absorbed quietly. He saw what the sacrifice demanded of his father. William has always approached leadership through structure rather than emotion. He compartmentalizes instinctively. Where Charles mourns privately, William converts grief into resolve. Yet witnessing the aftermath of this choice forced him to confront a truth he had rarely lingered on. One day, he would be asked to make similar choices, and when that day came, the crown would not care how he felt about them. The sacrifice clarified the future monarchy's emotional terrain. It would be leaner, more disciplined, less forgiving of unresolved attachment. That shift aligned with William's instincts, but he now understood the human toll those instincts would exact. For others within the family, the sacrifice functioned as a warning. It demonstrated that proximity to the crown was conditional, that history offered no immunity, that patience had limits, and those limits were enforced without sentiment once crossed. Some responded with quiet resignation, others with unease, a few with resentment they would never voice. But none misunderstood the message. The monarchy was done negotiating with its past. For Charles, the hardest moments came not in public or protocol, but in small absences that followed. A reference that would no longer be made, a routine that no longer existed, a voice that would not appear at the edges of his life again. These were not dramatic losses. They were cumulative. Each absence reinforced the permanence of what had been surrendered. Each quiet moment confirmed that the sacrifice was not temporary discomfort, but a lasting reconfiguration of his personal world. And yet, Charles did not waver. He had made the choice fully aware of its cost. To soften it now, to indulge regret publicly or privately, would undermine the clarity the crown required. Kings do not apologize for necessary decisions. They endure them. The sacrifice also changed how Charles viewed the remainder of his reign. He became more deliberate, more focused on legacy than repair. The decision closed off any lingering hope that reconciliation could define his kingship. Instead, it repositioned his role as one of consolidation, strengthening the institution so that what followed him would not inherit unresolved fractures. That clarity came at the expense of warmth, but the crown does not measure warmth, it measures survival. And in choosing survival, Charles had accepted that some losses are not meant to be redeemed, only absorbed. The sacrifice was complete. What remained was endurance, the inevitable change. In the immediate aftermath of the decision, the monarchy looked unchanged. The guards remained at their posts. The schedules moved forward. The crown rested where it always had. This is the great illusion of monarchy, that it can absorb almost anything without visible disturbance. Centuries of survival have taught it how to mask rupture behind routine, how to continue even as something essential is cut away beneath the surface. But inside the institution, and inside the man wearing the crown, nothing was the same. What King Charles III had done marked a quiet but irreversible turning point, not because the decision was unprecedented, but because it completed a transformation that had been unfolding since the moment he ascended the throne. Charles had spent much of his life preparing to inherit a monarchy shaped by patience, compromise, and gradual adjustment. Instead, he found himself presiding over one that demanded speed, clarity, and emotional austerity. This choice sealed that reality. In the days that followed, internal briefings reflected a new confidence. Issues that had once dominated discussions simply vanished from agendas. Risk assessments stabilized. Strategic planning moved forward without the constant need to hedge around unresolved personal entanglements. From an institutional perspective, the decision worked. That fact alone was sobering, because it confirmed the crown's most unsettling truth. It does not reward kindness. It rewards decisiveness, and it will always choose survival over sentiment if forced to decide between the two. Charles felt this truth settle into him slowly. He did not dramatize it. He did not dwell on regret, but he understood, with growing clarity, that this decision had redefined the emotional limits of his reign. There would be no late-life reconciliation arcs, no symbolic healings designed to soften history's judgment. What remained instead was consolidation, strengthening structures, clarifying authority, ensuring that what followed him would not inherit unfinished business. In that sense, this was not just a personal sacrifice. It was a gift, albeit a costly one, to the future of the monarchy. For Prince William, the aftermath carried profound significance. William observed the consequences closely, not as an outside critic, but as an heir studying the mechanics of power in real time. He saw how quickly the institution recalibrated, how decisively ambiguity was eliminated, how efficiently the crown closed ranks once clarity was imposed. He also saw what it took from his father. William has always believed that leadership requires emotional restraint, but witnessing this moment forced him to confront the depth of that requirement. This was not restraint in speech or behavior. This was a restraint of the heart itself. The lesson was unmistakable. When his time comes, the crown will not ask what he feels. It will ask what he is willing to give up. That realization did not frighten William, it prepared him. The monarchy emerging from this moment was leaner, colder, and more disciplined. It tolerated fewer exceptions. It offered less room for personal negotiation. It was in many ways the institution William had long argued it needed to become, but it was also an institution shaped by loss. That loss did not manifest in scandal or protest. It manifested in quiet absences, in relationships that no longer existed, in a narrowing of emotional range that made the monarchy more stable and more distant. For Charles, this distance became a new constant. He continued his duties with diligence. Publicly, there was no sign of strain. His speeches were measured, his appearances are steady. The image of continuity remained intact. Privately, however, his world had grown smaller, not emptier but narrower. There were fewer places where he allowed himself emotional ease, fewer conversations where he drifted into memory. The decision had taught him, once again, that attachment carries risk, and risk is something the crown does not tolerate for long. Those closest to him sensed this change and adjusted accordingly. Interactions became more formal. Emotional topics were avoided unless unavoidable. Everyone understood, instinctively, that the king was carrying something heavy and that probing it would serve no purpose. This is how the monarchy maintains its composure. By not asking, history will likely frame this moment as responsible stewardship. Analysts will speak of institutional stabilization, of necessary boundaries finally enforced. They will note how the monarchy emerged from a period of uncertainty with renewed clarity. They will be correct, but history will not record the private cost. It will not capture the long nights of reflection that preceded the choice. It will not note the quiet recalibration of a man who had hoped for much of his life that love and duty could coexist more gently than they ultimately did. That record exists only within Charles himself, and within the crown which now bears the imprint of his decision. Because the monarchy that survives this moment is not the same monarchy that entered it. It is more controlled, more disciplined, less forgiving of unresolved history. It will endure. But it will endure. The choice made minutes ago did exactly what it was meant to do. It protected the crown, it stabilized the future, it removed uncertainty at a critical moment, and in doing so it affirmed the oldest and hardest truth of monarchy: the crown always survives. The person wearing it pays the price. Charles understood that when he made his choice, and now, having made it, he carries its silence forward not as regret, not as doubt, but as the final confirmation that he has given the crown everything it asked of him, even the parts of himself it could never return. What unfolded here was not chaos but consequence. Inside the monarchy, the most damaging moments are rarely loud. They are remembered in who speaks less, who is consulted later, and who quietly loses influence. As this story continues to settle, its effects will shape decisions long after headlines fade. Stay with us, because the real shifts inside the crown are never announced. They are revealed over time.